As children, we all dream of having superpowers. We want to lift boulders with one hand and move things with our mind. We want to fly around our neighborhood or disappear from sight. When I was a kid, I spent so much time falling down that my superhero name could have been Captain Gravity. See, I have a nerve disorder called Charcot-Marie-Tooth that messes with the millions of signals my brain sends to my muscles every moment. So when my brain tells my legs and my muscles to keep standing, not all those signals make it all the way to my knees, for instance. I don't know if you know this, but knees are pretty dumb. And when they don't get all their messages, they quickly give up on their duties. And so whether I was standing in the shower or walking down a staircase, I would abruptly experience gravity. And this seems like a terrible superpower. I believe that. I believe you know that. But what I believe was super about it was what was going on inside my mind. Because faster than a sack of potatoes, I would accept that I was falling. Softer than a fluffy pillow, I would land as gently as possible. And then I would make my next move based on how much damage there was at the bottom. Now, this is not a good way to go through life. And so one of the things that my mom and I decided to do was look for a less leg-dependent mode of transportation for me. So I began using a wheelchair as a teenager. And my friends quickly saw it as an extension of me, like a new cool pair of shoes. And I noticed that maybe I had found my new superpower, making people stare. So my friends and I would walk and roll everywhere in town. And they'd always ask me, do you notice everyone turning their heads or stopping their car and looking? And I said, well, it's because we're awesome. Or maybe they noticed that my cousin had stuffed animals in the wheelchair, in the spokes of my chair. So, a few years ago, I was interviewed for the UW Oshkosh project, and I was asked, what's the first thing people notice about you? And I said, oh, it's my wheels. And pressed for the more interesting answer, she asked, what is it that people respond to? And I said, it's my smile. People respond to that immediately. I am addicted to people. Just seeing people makes me smile. And I went on to say, in spite of the bits of me that don't work right, like right now, I know that if I'm doing okay in this moment, I can smile about life. Now, that philosophy comes from two great philosophers in my life, Aristotle and my mom. Aristotle teaches an appreciation for moderation in all things. My mom would tell me, you may have it rough. Some people have it better, and some have it worse. So you better enjoy what you got. And I do. My mom also told me having a disability doesn't mean doing less. It's always going to mean working a little harder and doing a little bit more. So my first job was bagging groceries at our local grocery store. And I loved it. It was the most fun job I've had until the one I'm doing now. And in that, I would be at the end of the register, and I'd be bagging groceries, and the parents would be up talking to the cashier, and the kids would run down to the end of the register. And they'd always ask, why are you in the chair? Or why are you sitting down? And I'd tell them, oh, it's my legs don't work, or my legs are weak, and if I stood up, I'd probably fall over and spill your groceries. And the kids would accept that, and they'd run over to the gumball machine. And the parents would always get embarrassed. And they'd apologize, and I'd smile and say, it's okay, I love that they're curious, that's good. And I would reassure them that I wasn't offended. But it made me think, what is it that most people think of when they see someone with a disability? Because kids don't yet know that adults, we're scared most of the time. Kids don't yet know that adults see someone who is, they see human frailty, and they are personally confronted with the idea of death. And that comes from everyone we meet. We try on their life in our mind just for a moment. And we think, how would I spend that lotto jackpot? How cool would I look in that Ferrari? How would I take out the bad guy in this movie? And then sometimes we see people, and we're the hero of our own narrative. And sometimes we see people living lives that would be less easy to be the hero in that story. And they start to question that ability. They say, could I get out of bed every day if I had MS? Would I be able to support my family if I were blind? Could I smile if I couldn't stand up? Because sometimes strangers look at me sitting here and say, I should be happier than that guy, right? I learned early on that I've been given two remarkable gifts in my life. One is this very visible disability, and two is this obnoxiously optimistic attitude. And what I started to notice is as people would stare at me, I had a moment to connect with them, to influence how they are impacted by that moment of interaction. And so I decided to start smiling at people. More accurately, I decided to start smiling to people, making connections. I'm not talking about being happy all the time. That's unreasonable. And sometimes the world does push this tyranny of unconditional happiness on us. But in those times when we experience difficulty, when we experience challenge, instead of it becoming that thought in our mind of how we're going to do that, it becomes what we have to do, what we got to do to survive. And in those moments, it's really important that we know we're not alone. In my professional life, I teach the value of a genuine smile during networking, how a genuine smile conveys respect and presence and makes that kind of connection. With the attitude that I've developed, I connected deeply with Marianne Williamson's poem In A Return to Love, where she writes, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." Our smile is that gift we give each other in that moment. And it reminded me of the idea of namaste. Namaste was described to me as the light in me honors the light in you. The place in me where the entire universe resides honors the place in you. I honor the love, hope, faith, and beauty that is within you and also within me. In this moment, we are together. We are one. That's a pretty great description of a smile, right? Philosopher Thomas Hobbes said, or wrote, rather, I don't know what he sounded like, the life of man outside society would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But in society, within community, with one another, we are comforted. Life is better. When I was a teenager, I crashed my car trying to avoid a possum, which I don't recommend doing. But in that moment, I learned that crashing is not unlike falling, and I was already pretty good at that. I had to accept that the crash was happening. I then had to land as gently as possible, and then I had to make my next move based on considerable damage. So when the collision stopped on the side of the road, on that country road that night, I turned off the car radio. I looked, and my friend and I were knocked around, but mostly okay, and neither of us could get out of my mangled car. And it wasn't too long before the police and the ambulance showed up, and right before they got there, I noticed my dumb right knee had whacked a piece of metal on my steering wheel, and it cut a clean hole right through where I could see the tendons in my kneecap. And because I'm me, I would wiggle my toes and see if I could move them. But there wasn't too much blood, so I knew we weren't in a dire situation. But also, because it's a small town, I knew the first responders that showed up on the scene. And so when the officer walked up to my shattered window, he shined his light in the car and then down on my right knee. I looked up at him, said, "How's your night going, Pat?" He looked back at me, looked me in the eye, and said, "Better than yours." Sergeant Yo's smile in that moment told me it was going to be okay. We were going to be okay. Because when you share a smile with another person, you create a tiny, safe, compassionate community in that moment. And by living intentionally, by making those connections, we're reminded that we are all powerful in spite of our barriers. So it doesn't matter if there's a wheelchair or a flesh wound or any kind of disability or difficulty of any sort. Together, we can make it through those challenges. One day in college, I was just finished my finals and I was eating lunch, and a student walked up to me and said, "You don't know my name, but you're the reason I passed my classes this semester." And I must have looked confused or surprised, because he went on to say, "I'm from down south, and every time it got cold, I would make up every excuse I could to stay in my warm bed. And then every morning, I'd look out the window, whether it was raining, snowing, ice, you'd be out there pushing your chair to class. And again, I don't know your name, but we live in the same building. We go to the classes in the same hall across campus. And you would be the one showing up every day with a smile on your face." And I'd think, what's my deal? And I get out of bed and I go to class. Now, I don't know what path that student took after that conversation we had that day, but I know he's better off than he would have been if I wasn't outside smiling in the rain. Because sometimes your smile is a lifeboat. Sometimes it's a rocket ship. And it's always powerful beyond measure. So in a world where you can be anything, be kind, be connected, smile, and give others superpowers.